Well, welcome. What an amazing opening. Thank you, Ed. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all are enjoying the summit, and that was just all the energy, the love on top energy that I think we all needed. Thank you all so much for being here back for our evening sessions at We Give Summit. And again, thank you, Ed, for that lively music to get us all right and in the right mood to have a great conversation. My name is Tyeshia Wilson. I have the absolute joy and the privilege of serving as the Director of Engagement at Philanthropy Together, and the honor of moderating this powerful and timely discussion today, moving at the speed of trust, funding leaders of color equitably. Full transparency, y'all, the opportunity to moderate this discussion is very personal for me. I am a member of Heritage Giving Fund, which is the first Black giving circle in my home state of Texas. Go Cowboys. We were founded in 2017 and set a very unapologetic mission to promote Black philanthropy and to provide a source of funding for Black women-led, Black benefiting organizations throughout North Texas. So this is a full circle moment to have this conversation with Hali and Cheryl today. Now, I know that you all are just as eager as I am to learn and to hear from our dynamic panelists. But before I jump in, I'd like to set the stage for our discussion by identifying 3 goals that we hope to achieve with you all during our time together. The first is getting rooted on the issue to understand why it is more difficult for people of color to receive more funding. The second is to define what actionable steps we can take now as philanthropists, as Giving Circle members, leaders, supporters, to build trust and to bridge the funding gap to more equitably fund leaders of color. And the last is to set some intentions on how we can hold philanthropy and the broader Giving Circle and the collective giving movement accountable to ensure that moving forward together, leaders of color are seen, heard, and invested in. And so as Angela Blackwell during our opening ceremony said today, if we can't talk about it, we can't solve it. So today, let's lean in together and we're gonna talk about it. And with that, it is a joy to introduce our panelists. In community with us is our 2 dynamic, outstanding philanthropists, equity advocates, and trailblazers in philanthropy. Cheryl Dorsey is a trailblazer. She is in the social entrepreneurship movement. She's the president of Eco and Green, which is a global nonprofit that supports emerging social entrepreneurs and invests deeply in their ideas and leadership. And their organization is a leading voice on racial biases in funding. Cheryl also is a frequent speaker on racial justice and equity in philanthropy. She has advocated for equitable funding for leaders of color on panels organized by the Stanford Social Innovation Review, the World Economic Forum, and more. And in 2020, Cheryl co-authored a research report in partnership with the Bridgespan Group, Racial Equity and Philanthropy, Disparities in Funding for Leaders of Color, Leave Impact on the Table, which we'll learn more about that in just a second. Welcome, Cheryl, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Ty. Appreciate you.
Welcome. Hali is a trailblazer as well, and she has been a co-builder on a number of philanthropic infrastructure. She is the founding partner of Radiant Strategies, which she was also on the co-design team for our organization, Philanthropy Together. She is the founder of the Asian Women Giving Circle, and she co-founded the Donors of Color Network, which is the first ever cross-racial community of donors and movement leaders committed to building the collective power of people of color to achieve racial equity. Also noted that she was recently profiled in Forbes 50 over 50 Impact, and we are just super honored to have Hali. She's real friends. So welcome, Hali, and thank you for being here.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Ty.
And before we jump into these questions, y'all, and we probably will go over about 5 minutes, but I needed that energy from Ed, and so we'll make up some time. But before we jump into these questions, Cheryl, Hali, did y'all have any opening remarks to set and to share with the audience before we get started?
I just want to thank you, Ty, for stepping in as moderator, and Sadi and Kyson and Isis and the whole Philanthropy Together team, and my Giving Circle sisters, and Latara Kamari, my buddy and partner at Radiant. And this is an all hands on all decks moment. So we got to do it.
Yes.
Beautifully said, Hali. The only thing I would add, Ty, is just to start with a land acknowledgement. I always like to start by recognizing the indigenous people of the land where I now sit. It's the land of the Nacotchtanks. It's a name derived from the word Anakwashatinik, meaning a town of traders. I really do like to begin my sessions like these, and even though, of course, I recognize that a land acknowledgement is not enough, I do believe it's a really important, social justice and decolonial practice, and it's just a reminder of why visibility matters, and we've got to constantly remind ourselves that we're on settled indigenous land. So thank you for giving me that time and space.
Of course, and thanks for lifting that. Thank you to you both. Okay, Cheryl, well, let's get rooted. So as I mentioned, in 2020, you co-authored this striking report. I'm still reading it, still processing it. The Racial Equity and Philanthropy, that really highlighted the disparities in funding for leaders of color. The report notes that two of the biggest challenges or the biggest factors holding back philanthropy's efforts to help advance social change are rooted in race. Can you share more about the findings of your report? Why addressing race and racial disparities is important to understand why it has been so difficult for people of color to receive philanthropic funding?
Absolutely. So I know I only have sort of 5 minutes to sort of set the stage through some of the data that we came up with. And I'm going to sort of broaden it out as well, Ty, and add in some other data to remind ourselves of just how deep these structural inequities are, right? So in the title of this panel, you all lifted up wisely that only 8% of philanthropic funding goes to communities of color, but let's look at it from a bunch of different angles. So you mentioned the study and report that we did with our friends from Bridgespan. In many ways, the Echo and Green community represented the perfect sample set, right? Echo and Green, as you mentioned, global nonprofit. Every year we do a global social business plan competition. We get 3,000 submissions from 160 countries around the world. We put folks through their paces. It is a rigorous, if not downright Darwinian vetting process. And at the end of this process, we ultimately invest in less than 1% of the folks who come through our process. And over the years, supporting 900 or so Echo and Echoing Green Fellows, it, spans the gamut from probably our most famous alums, Michelle Obama, Van Jones, folks who appear on the 10 Audacious list every year, the founders of Girl Trek, Last Mile Health, NorHealth, as the list of grantees from McKinsey Scott, littered with a bunch of Echoing Green folks. Like, our folks are good, but time after time, year after year, we were seeing this gap, and it was sort of this immovable gap between the amount of money that Black folks in our network were raising versus their white counterparts. So again, you've got these folks who had made it to the mountaintop of Echoing Green, but despite that, and despite the imprimatur of Echoing Green Fellowship, these funding disparities ran deep. So I'll quickly run through the stats. Everything from looking at our applicant pool every year, the disparities between the Black applicants versus the white applicants was a $20 million gap. So just think about that, right? So people going through this process cumulatively were experiencing these difficulties in driving funding. Then when you got to the bridge band work that we did in partnership with them, we noted that even 3 years into the fellowship, our Black fellows were raising like 24% less revenue than their white counterparts. And when you looked even more closely, Ty, and looked at unrestricted net assets, they were raising 74% less unrestricted net assets. And we all know what that pot of money does. It is that soft place to fall, that cushion to dream, to plan, to pivot. So all of those strictures on Black leaders trying to run and grow and lead these organizations sort of played out in the data. The last specific piece of data in the study that I'll share with you was an even finer point on the disparities when you looked at Echoing Green Fellows within our network who were part of our Black Male Achievement Fellowship program. These were folks who were doing deep social change work, trying to improve the life outcomes of men and boys of color in this country. The Black folks in that fellowship, Ty, raising 45% less revenue compared to their white counterparts in the Black Male Achievement Fellowship program, 91% less unrestricted net assets compared to their white counterparts. So these numbers say it all. And again, this is played out time and time again across our sector. When you look at Echoing Green organizations led by folks of color or folks who are doing racial equity work, Ty, if you were simply to upsize folks in our network who were small, trying to get to $1 million per year in terms of their budget size, or trying to climb the ladder from $1 million up to $5 million, if we collectively upsize those folks and their organizations in our portfolio, they could absorb an additional $1.5 billion annually. That's how steep these inequities are. And again, this data is not unique to Echoing Green. Our friends at New Profit did some interesting research at the mezzanine stage. We're early stage funders, but when you look at mezzanine stage, Black and Latinx leaders receive only 4% of funding, even though they make up about 10% of the nonprofit leaders at this stage. And then even if you look at the big bets data, when you look at the number of big bets that have been documented between the years of 2010 and 2014, only about 11% went to organizations led by people of color. And look, if we take out Jeff Cannon and Harlem's Children's Zone, they account for a third of that. So this is how deep and how inequitable these disparities lie. So that's the data. I think I would be remiss, Ty, if I didn't sort of contextualize that data in this moment. Let me say a couple things. We're not only trying to dig ourselves out of a hole, but the hole has gotten deeper during COVID. During the pandemic, 46% of Black-led nonprofits saw a decline in their funding. Imagine asking Black-led folks, BIPOC folks, to do more in the moment of the pandemic, but we're given less resources. On top of that, you want to talk about accountability. There's some very interesting research, you all, coming out of the World Economic Forum that showed that as of January 2022, only 1% of the $67 billion pledged toward racial equity by the largest companies in the world has been dispersed. So you've got all of these structural factors sort of colliding in a really problematic way. So that's the data. I know I ran through it, but it's important. The numbers tell the story, right? And underneath it all, you ask why. And I think all of us who do this work, who care about this work, know why. It's because two of the biggest factors that are holding back philanthropy's efforts to help advance social change are rooted in race. One is understanding the role of race in the problems philanthropists are trying to solve. There's a blind spot around the contextual analysis of the role of race in the problems they're trying to solve. The second is there's deep significance when it comes to race when how philanthropists identify leaders and find solutions. They bypass, they overlook, they lock out leaders of color, and it all adds up to a mismatch between dollars that should be flowing to these world-class, best-in-class, proximate leaders and the solutions they're generating. And it's something that we all have got to lock arms and figure out how to address together. And the last why that I'll share, Ty, is that it's not only sort of unintentional and intentional racial bias, it's also because folks of color are often doing deep social change work. And we also know that philanthropy underinvests in social change work. So again, the collision of all these factors really super tough for BIPOC leaders.
The data. Thank you so much for that context, Cheryl. We have to, those numbers are critical. And I'm glad that you are, that you lifted up just the biases as well that exist, because in Hali's report, she talks about this. Hali, your report, Philanthropy Always Sounds Like Someone Else. It's a first of its kind report, and it tells the powerful and nerving stories really of high net worth donors of color and what they have faced, and the disparities that exist with how we engage with them. And so I want to bring you in to lift this piece up of, first off, why did you even name the report that? And also who was involved in the research? And then how do those biases that even Cheryl just mentioned and current narratives that exist out in the world and that were revealed in your report lead to the underinvestment of BIPOC leaders?
Thank you, Ty. And Cheryl, oh my God, I wish we could have more time talking about this, because it's so interesting, because you're painting a picture of one side of the philanthropic table in conversation. And then this report that I'm about to share highlights from kind of paints the picture from the other side of that same table, right? I just wish we had more time. And Isis, while you're dropping stuff, can you share the PRE report mismatch that's just about how the dollars didn't really flow post George Floyd in more detail? I think that might be a really interesting complement to what Cheryl just shared. And Cheryl, that's so cool. I'm going to read your report again. So quickly, why did we've put out two reports that we both have very interesting names. And the first one is the apparitional donor. And that was written by the legendary Urvashi Vad, the great Urvashi Vad. And that's sort of a landscape analysis of everything we could find ever written by and for giving in communities of color ever. And it's pretty exhaustive to 2016. And we called that one the apparitional donor because donors of color in the literature are literally ghostly. And we knew we were there, but we needed to prove our very existence in the sector. What sparked that report was honestly a little bit of anger. You know, Urvashi, Ashindi Maxon, and I speak a lot at conferences for the past several years, and we would often be in these rooms where the donors sitting in the audience the audiences were so white, and the people on the stage were often folks of color. And we just were like, well, we know we're out there, and because of the work we've done with different donor networks and in philanthropy, we just had access to people who knew people, kind of. And so we set out to do part two, which is this portrait report. And I got to lead this portrait report, research and writing, and it was just a blast to do, as you can imagine. Just very briefly, the report encompasses the stories and themes of 113 wealthy donors of color in 10 cities across the country. It is not exhaustive. It is representative of nothing other than who Hali, Urvashi, and Ashindi, and a few others could say yes, to get to say yes to being interviewed by us. We did 90-minute conversations in person whenever possible. And we talked about families and joy and themes and legacy. And at the very end of the conversation, we got into philanthropy. It's important to remember, I think, especially here, that we that we all come from cultures of giving. So not only are donors of color apparitional in the philanthropic research and data, but our stories are apparitional in life. But we all come from cultures of giving, every single one of you in this audience. And as I say these words, think about your grandparents, whoever you are in this audience and wherever you come from, and put it in the chat if there's somewhere that you come from, if this rings a bell for you. So I'm Korean, and we have something called a ge in my culture, in which we pull our money and give it away. Have you heard of susus or tandas or sadakas or tithing or potlatch or mahabers or zakat? So do me a favor. Oh, thank you, Peter, you dropped one. So put some ideas in the chat of things that you have in your culture that helped teach and instill and pass on this concept of generosity. Okay, I have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to race through some themes. Ty, you're a tough boss, man. Like the whole report in 5 minutes for me and Cheryl. Okay, so some high-level themes. Please read the report. And there's a summary that you can read. There's also an essay I wrote for I forget which journal, and it's much easier to read, to be perfectly honest. So quick sketch of the donors that we interviewed. Remember, we did it's a low estimate, but about 1 in 8 millionaire households in America that are millionaire households are led by a person of color, about 15%. The median annual giving of the folks that we interviewed is $87,000 in annual giving. The range went up to $17 million in annual giving, just of the 113 people that we interviewed. Nearly every single person I interviewed, and I interviewed all but 5, nearly every single person had personally experienced racism, discrimination, or bias based on the color of their skin, their country of origin, their accent, their religion, the way they looked. They talked about the racial wealth gap without calling it the racial wealth gap. They talked about anti-miscegenation laws that prevented their families from being married in one state. They talked about redlining that prevented their moms and dads or grandpas and grandpas from owning homes in this part of town and going over to that part of town. And there's pros and cons to all of these stories, but I'm just going to gloss over some of the nuance just to share these themes. They talked about the systemic barriers to building wealth and passing along wealth that have existed always for families of color in this country. About 80% of our sample are wealth earners and wealth creators themselves. About 10% married into families with wealth, and about 10% are inheritors. This is just of our sample again. So the folks that we interviewed who are creating wealth themselves, this 80% had, in many cases, just leapfrogged multiple rungs on the socioeconomic ladder, and they themselves grew up quite poor, working class, middle class, and in some cases very, very, very poor, which raises a whole host of issues that people were very candid about, like the awkwardness of being asked to borrow, like the awkwardness of having a dad asked to borrow money, for example, and the need that is so often right in front of their faces in their neighborhoods, their friends, their cousins, their aunties, their childhood friends right in front of them, and how those friends and family needs becomes a competition for some of the charitable and political donations that folks want to make. This idea of being part of a cross-class family and a cross-class community was very, very prevalent and resonant for the folks that we interviewed. In terms of destinations of their giving, education was the #1 place, just like almost any survey of wealthy donors in this country. But number 2, 3, and 4 were racial justice, economic justice, and social justice. And I promise you, you will not find that in any survey of wealthy donors generally, which usually means wealthy white donors. The folks that we interviewed are highly networked, but not with each other and not usually philanthropically. And the last theme I'll share, Ty, before I stop talking, is this idea, and this is a direct quote from someone, bull straps is bull honky, you can fill in the blank. And this story was told to me by a Black man in his 50s who for a period of time in his childhood, his family lived in a station wagon. And of the 5, 6, 7 people who lived in and out of that station wagon, he's the one who kind of made it out of poverty. He grew up in a southern city in America. And one of the things that he attributed many things to his success, including, he said something really great, like he's a gay Black man in his 50s. And he said, he's a big, tall guy. And he said, patriarchy could be good if you're a man. So he attributed certain systemic things that helped him. And also that he's a commanding man who can command a room with a big voice. He talked about that. So some innate things, and also the love, importantly, of his mom and grandma and aunties and uncles, and lots of aunties. And he talked about one auntie in particular who taught him how to read a menu at a restaurant, because that's something he hadn't done, and who planted the seed for him to go to college, because that wasn't really on his radar at that time. He was a little kid at this time, he's telling me. And he said this beautiful thing that just made me cry then and almost could make me cry now. And we were both bawling when he told me this story about how the aunties in his life, this Auntie Mame in particular, could see the boy in the king and the king in the boy. And his aunties were able to see both in him.
Listening to, thank you. Cheryl, just with you and the data, Hali, with you, the narratives, the stories, y'all, all of this is so important. And it really is a counter narrative to what we hear, or what we see traditional philanthropy say about people of color. It also really helps us to anchor in this kind of uncomfortable truth of the feel-good vibe of philanthropy. But it also is inspiring, because it does tell us that there is room, there is opportunity for us to do better. And we should do better, and we have some work to do. Philanthropy is not exempt from the work that is required to build a more equitable society. So I really thank y'all for grounding us in that why. Now I want to pivot our conversation though from the issue and the why to solutions forward. That's what we're here for. We're ready to act. We're ready to move forward together. So with all of this, how do you all think, and y'all can tag team on this question, how do y'all think that how are we going to change this? It doesn't seem like it's enough to call out just the inequities in funding, but to know how to find solutions, the processes, et cetera, to embed trust-based philanthropy in our everyday practices. So what does this moving at the speed of trust actually look like? Please tell us some tangible ways and how we as funders and giving circle leaders can really break down those barriers and biases that exist in philanthropy.
I'll hop in, Cheryl, if you don't mind, and then I'll go on mute. It just is on my mind. Isis and I were talking about this the other day. I happened to see a post from Rebecca Solnit come across Facebook, and she wrote something, I'm going to butcher it, but it was basically that it's super important with some parts of our lives to be with people who are just like us. And it gets to something that Angela Glover Blackwell was talking about this morning, and I'll connect that in a second. But equally important to that, according to Solnit, it's just as important to spend a big chunk of our lives with people who are very, very much not like us, because that is the way that we can start to build relationships and cross some of those divides that seem to just be more and more pronounced in our community right now. I'm involved in building this other project called Freedom School for Philanthropy, and I see some friends on this chat. Hi, Tony. Hi, Afi, who've been helping us. And one of the themes that we hear from the research that we did is that it's super important. Like, this is so small, but it could be very profound. We were talking to a woman who's a white donor and very wealthy, and she doesn't have a lot of friends who are people of color. So as a way for her to start to bridge some of the divides for herself, she decided to read novels only written in translation, set in places very, very different from what she was familiar with and what she knew. And I thought that was actually a pretty good idea for the beginnings of like a journey and the beginnings of self-awareness and self-reflection and self-learning, which is one of the things Angela was so eloquent about this morning. I'll stop there. Cheryl, tossing it to you.
Yeah, no, Hali, you know better than I on this front, given the work that you do. But, I would say there's sort of, how do you get into the right mindset? And from my vantage point, running a nonprofit, organization for many years. I'm impressed by the momentum of sort of the trust-based philanthropy movement, right? They're like, here are the 5 principles, here's what you do, you shift power, all that kind of stuff. And that seems like, yeah, that's perfect. So read about it, join it, start doing it. I'm also incredibly impressed with some of the work that the Justice Funders Network has done on sort of like shifting from an extractive approach to a regenerative approach, right? Like, how are we going to move not just sort of decision-making approaches, but also how you think about your endowment? What are your operating principles and practices look like? So I think there are an increasing number of frameworks out there that allow folks to go on this journey and really make headway against this. And sometimes you just got to start. You just got to start making the road by walking. And the easiest way to do it is just start moving money, start writing checks, recognizing that you are going to learn a tremendous amount, and that has inherent value in and of itself. I'm also fond of saying, and maybe it's just my perspective, that as someone who runs an intermediary, we really sit nicely between the rooftops and the grassroots. And there really is a chasm, which shows up in some of the data. And it's going to take a minute for sort of this chasm to be reduced. And in a way, in the same way that you sort of had the emergence and development of the CDFI space in the financial services industry, there, I think, is a whole body of work that a group of us are doing, whether it's Echoing Green, Camelback, New Schools Venture Fund, of saying, we can help you get there, because we're sort of this trusted intermediary, we're a bridge, and sort of affiliating yourself with some of those groups who are in contact with these amazing, dazzling leaders of color who know what's up, who know where the good investments are, how to navigate these spaces. And I think sort of starting to think about your work through this ecosystem approach and how you sort of link arms with like-minded folks is not a bad way to move forward.
That's a great frame, an ecosystem approach. And can I add one more, Ty, to that sort of frame? Yeah. Something that I've been thinking about also is like this idea of expansiveness. You know, I think we live in a socio-political moment that's so much about shrinking and taking away things and defining us into little tiny boxes. And like, if we can expand our thinking, I mean, I think the portrait report in some ways is like expanding the idea of who is a donor, who is a philanthropist, expanding the idea of people of color as clients and customers, donors and philanthropists. In a similar way, can we be expansive about who we think of as a voter and who we think of as our neighbor and who we think of even as our family, you know? And I think if we all do that, like inside, within our hearts and around dinner tables, then I think that will help us get across some of the divides that seem to be all around us.
Yeah, and you know, trust is at the core of trust-based philanthropy, that whole framework, right? And my heart is sitting with what you all are sharing. I'm wondering, well, what would be the risk if we did not lean into this spirit of trust, trusting leaders of color, trusting them with the funding, really pushing funding to better support them? What are we risking if we don't move forward and change our mindset, to your point, Cheryl, like in Hali, like what are we missing, or what is at stake by not trusting and engaging with BIPOC leaders and donors in this way?
I mean, our democracy, our world, the world in which we live. I mean, like I said up top, this is an all hands on all decks moment. And to not expand our thinking about who is a citizen, who is a voter, expand our thinking about who is a donor and a philanthropist and a human, leaves critical resources and critical life experiences literally on the table. And in addition to that, it means that the world, like not being expansive in our thinking, means the world of possible solutions available to us, it just shrinks. And that's just unacceptable in the world that we're living in.
Yep, I couldn't have said it any better. And I think, you know, Hali and I are not being, I think, hyperbolic. I think this is an existential moment, right? We have not even come close to what it means to be a full multiracial democracy. And we're in the early stages of this, you know, look, 1965, whatever. And it is seen forces around this country are fighting back against that every day. I will say this is a global phenomenon, right? We've seen the rise of populism walk its way across Western democracies starting in the 1990s through the early aughts, and it is here on our shores, and it's about to get worse before it gets better. And as Hali said, all hands on deck moment. But the scale of the problem belies the way we're going to win this. And I spent a lot of time in the last year or so reading folks like Anne Applebaum, scholars who have dug deep into the roots of populism, authoritarianism. And even though this is so existential, this is crisis level, red lights flashing, the fix is just working local problems every day, right? It is going hyper local, creating a sense of belonging and inclusion, not by the big things. We're going to beg to differ at the Thanksgiving table about who you voted for, but let's fix the pothole together. And once you fix the pothole together in your town, then let's talk about some other stuff. And then we talk about other stuff. And it's literally putting those pieces together day by day, hour by hour, month by month. And it's like sticking to that knitting in hand-to-hand relationship building, and that's the only way through it. But the clock is ticking, and we're an election cycle away from being in truly dire circumstances.
The scale of the problems that we face, Ty, and all of us on this call know this, are just simply too large for any one philanthropist, no matter how rich or how white they are, to fix, right? So it really is a moment that calls for collective action. I mean, I think what Mackenzie's doing is amazing, right? But the scale of the crisis that we face calls for collective action, and collective action has always been the thing that moves our country towards its better self, like a little bit towards its better self.
Yes, and that collective action, Cheryl, and you, a quote that you had mentioned in your report is that, like, we all lose if we don't move forward in this way, right? If we're not intentional about addressing the racial disparities, if we're not intentional about the way that or our own implicit biases, and just leaning into the issues that are plaguing our nation, then everyone loses, because those disparities just drag on not only just our individual growth, but our economic growth, our prosperity and well-being as a nation. And so this is great. Okay, so solutions in terms of, from my accountability stance, to fund and invest in leaders of color and moving forward with this thought. How do Giving Circle leaders, like, what does that allyship look like for Giving Circle leaders and the members to situate them, to better situate ourselves in this model, and leaning more into this idea of solidarity and trust, and what does that allyship look like?
I got to be part of the Lunar Project's first circle this year, and they're launching a second one pretty soon. And the first cycle was all Asian American women and gender expansive folks who pulled money and raised money to fund Black and Indigenous organizing, period. And I think that it was not only a blast to get to meet other values aligned Asian American women and gender expansive folks across the country. They asked us to meet for 3 hours every Monday night for like a semester. So just imagine saying yes to that. I couldn't believe I was saying yes to that, but it was one of those things like, I gotta say yes to that. And it was amazing. And I just think there's something in that for all of us, like to really, I don't know that much about Black and Indigenous organizing except for the last 10 years. I didn't grow up in that culture and community and ethos. I grew up in a pretty white suburb in the Midwest in Kansas City. So it was such a good learning for us to do this in a group of trusted people with some shared experiences to fund something that was outside of almost all of our shared lived experiences.
Yeah, and I would say, again, my experience is way more theoretical than Hallie's leadership and deep knowledge of the space. But from the other side of it, you're like, oh, how could collective giving circles make a difference? And I really thought hard about it, because I do think it is a movement and an opportunity, especially in this moment when philanthropy is being disrupted, given that Hali mentioned stuff like Mackenzie Scott and the way she showed up. But I think there are a couple of things. Sort of Giving Circle sort of making explicit commitments to write checks to BIPOC-led organizations. Just start writing the checks, as I mentioned. And then I also think there's something about writing bigger checks and making that commitment, because I see nonprofits, and when I started my nonprofit, there's something that I call the fog of war. When you are small and you are just trying to keep your head above water, you can't plan, you can't strategize, you can't vision. And so many BIPOC organizations never get out of that fog. If you can lift them up and out of that, you then allow them to get into these slipstreams of funding that allow for larger check sizes with more institutional funders. And that's that like liftoff, that trajectory. And I think these giving circles, collective giving opportunities are well suited to do the work. And, I also think there's a level of facility, being facile, being nimble, that these institutional funders don't have. You have the opportunity to surge resources where you see stuff on the ground that is really taking advantage of a window of opportunity, which is huge, huge. And then I also think increasingly being able to lever and take advantage of different financial instruments. What about a revolving loan fund? What about an early stage equity investment? What about a convertible note? Like that stuff y'all can do that is so critical. That's like the Swiss Army knife approach that could really be supportive of BIPOC organizations. And I just think, right, as we're trying to revamp, rethink, reimagine this philanthropic ecosystem, the potential that you all have while building power is unparalleled.
Plus to that, Cheryl, I love it. And I think, I'm going to harp on this theme of expansiveness. Like if we expand the idea of capacity building, right? Like back in the day, Cheryl, you remember this, like capacity building meant asking for money to hire a part-time development director when you're a super scrappy nonprofit on the ground, like I'm sure you were, and I've been multiple times, right? So that used to be capacity building, but now it's like, hey, let's buy the building or let's underwrite the mortgage for that important organization, or let's fund care and rest, sabbaticals for leaders. Let's invest in leaders of color, women of color leaders, to take some time to think and write. That's expansive thinking. Can I add a story, Ty? Do I have time to share one of my favorite?
You have some time.
Okay. I'll try to be quick, and many of you have probably heard this, but the Asian Women Giving Circle, we're 17 years old. We're all volunteer. We've moved over $1 million in New York City to arts and activists in our city. And here's an example of a Giving Circle grant that was $4,000. So 2009, a group of scrappy, queer, Asian American activists applied for a grant to integrate the official Lunar New Year parade in Chinatown to include queer folks, because at that time you couldn't be out and gay and march. It was 2009 or 2010, and they asked us for $4,000. And of course we funded it, and of course we said, we'll march with you. We'll crash the party with you guys, and it's going to be super fun. And I think we were their only funder who wasn't a blood relative. And I think our $4,000 paid for beer, Oreos, and art supplies to make puppet kites and rainbow flags, etc. That bright February day, they got permission to march at the last minute. They were kind of bummed that they weren't going to crash it, but they got official permission to march. So we marched with them in early February. They integrated the official Lunar New Year Chinatown Parade for All. This was called Lunar New Year for All, I think the name of the project. They integrated their parade before the Irish. They were interviewed in the Times, Time Out New York. I was cutting vegetables that night for dinner. I heard them interviewed on my local NPR station. They made history for $4,000. And we, their only funder, the Asian Women Giving Circle, we were like 2 years old at that time. We got to stand alongside them, like, aunties cheering on the sidelines, to make history along with them. So that's one small story of how one Giving Circle can literally change the world.
I love that you looked at that, Hali, because we often talk about, first off, we know Giving Circles we're not checkbook philanthropy. A lot of us, we don't just give the grants. I know my Giving Circle, we don't give the grant and then that's it. Our grantees never hear from us. We really do lean into the right way to cultivate that relationship with our grantees in such a way that they can sustain even beyond our grant cycle. We're thinking about other ways other needs that they have? How can we fund in different ways, as we talk about often in this space, our time, talent, treasure, testimony, and those ties? That story really pulls that out, because there's so many other ways in how we can cultivate the relationships, especially with our grantees and these BIPOC grassroots leaders, in such a way to help them sustain. And I think that is a great story and a lift, because that's allyship, and that goes back to that question of the role. What does that look like? And so
heritage plays the same role. Like, you're lifting up
Exactly.
groups to Texas Women's Foundation that they don't know about, as connected as they are. You know, I'm Texas Women's Foundation, I'm a huge fan, like they're super connected, but you're more connected. And same with us. Like, even in a giant city like New York City, I love the New York Women's Foundation. I just put them into my will, but they don't know about these little projects happening on the ground in the same way that I do and my Giving Circle sisters do. So I think that's an important role that we can say. And I'm going to just throw in one more piece of editorializing, which is that philanthropy is not synonymous with logic models or strategic plans or theories of change. You know, like Giving Circles, we give money for the long haul. Like this group Q-Wave, we've supported them maybe 5 times for very different projects that are very different from the first ones. Like, we don't have a logic model. We don't have a theory of change. I don't have a 1-page flow chart of whatever. Like, I feel like, you know, Giving Circles in some ways are doing like what philanthropy, the root of it, you know, love of humankind, love of people. I think we're closer to the root of it than a lot of our current sector has become.
Yes, and and I think that we are blazing a trail to where we have, like, to your point, the foundations. They're paying attention, and they too are making changes. And so, actually, one of the quotes, Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, he says this: as funders, we need to reject that impulse to put grant making rather than change making at the center of our worldview, and just to listen and to learn and lift up those voices who are most proximate and most essential to unlocking solutions is critical to the type of change that we're making and that we want to see in our communities. And Giving Circles are blazing the trail in that way, as well as other foundations that's leaning into it, the Borales Foundation, the Ford Foundation. So they are taking note. And so I think that, we are certainly bringing forth a paradigm shift in philanthropy by focusing on equity in philanthropy. And moving at the speed of trust really starts with us, is what I hear you and Cheryl telling us. And even with Angela from earlier, that we talk about transformational solidarity, all of this, it really starts with us. And so in these last, I know we're at time, in this, in our final minute or so, I really want to hear, y'all have been sharing so much of your heart, and I appreciate it. But leave us with a hope message. What is giving you both hope? Because y'all are so rooted in the data, you're seeing all of that, but what gives y'all hope for a more equitable society if we do this thing right? If we do all the things right and do all the steps and do the work of what you all have suggested today to fund more leaders of color, what is giving you hope?
Sure, I'll go first. So I get the privilege of working with social innovators from all over the world every day, including a large number of BIPOC social innovators, and their work, their commitment, the way they raise up Black joy in doing this work, despite the trials and tribulations, keeps me at this work every day. I'm going to share a link. We are doing a virtual premiere tomorrow of a new short documentary called Unwavering: The Power of Black Innovation. And every time I watch it a gazillion times. And I'm, more motivated to get back in the fight every single day after listening to these innovators and what they choose to do with their talents and gifts every single day. So if you're available tomorrow afternoon, check out the documentary, register on the link I just shared, and it will lift your spirits and remind you all why you do what you do.
And I think we get to watch a clip of it right now, right, Cheryl? Just right? I think that's next. And I think the thing that gives me hope, Ty, is what we're talking about, like this expansive thinking of moving from a me to a we.
Well, thank you, Hali and Cheryl, for leading and showing us the way. You all are such a good source of inspiration to so many of us in this movement, who are literally putting our hand to the plow in action to find leaders of color. And we see you, we acknowledge your efforts. And I want to also give a shout out to our sponsor for this conversation, Comcast, NBC Universal, for helping us to have this conversation and creating the space for us to do so. We do have a clip that we want to share with y'all that highlights the movie Unwavering that Cheryl has lifted up. But before we leave out, I did want to go ahead and ask y'all to remember that we're going to answer a 2-question poll before we exit. So please, the poll just launched, and stay on a Zoom. We're going to watch this trailer, and we hope to see you all at the next session, which is a good segue into continue the conversation we are providers of looking to giving circles led by men of color, starting at 7 p.m. ET, and we'll see y'all right in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Talk to us about Blackness. What does that look like?
Black people have always been innovators. It's in our nature to innovate. It always has been, out of necessity.
Survival innovation is the same thing. Someone just said, let's make it a fancy term.
We've had to cut our own path, but it's hard. So it needs support.
The microaggressions, the overt, the covert racism, all of that can leave a chip on your shoulder. And it can change the way that you show up in this world.
When nobody else believes in a Black leader, usually their business dies.
There are conversations that you can't have with funders. And so for the first time, it was an opportunity to have an honest conversation. But it came at us watching the murder of so many innocent Black men.
To have people actually tell you that, I want to give you money because I feel guilty. It's like, yo, man, like that's not philanthropy. It's not about guilt. It's about recognizing that we need to even things out.
We are sitting in a moment in which Black people, we're the flavor. But look, we always been the flavor. We know we've always been the flavor. It's just that everybody else is discovering that we're the flavor of this moment.
Black innovation is happening everywhere. It's always happened everywhere. The question is do we have access to capital? Do we have access to social capital? Do we have access to the supports and the larger community of belief that we're worthy of investing?
What does a Black community look like with power and autonomy over its own destiny?